Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Avidan Cover. I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. Thank you all for joining us. We are recording as well, so thank you for those joining remotely for our panel discussion on the legal implications of a second Trump presidency. Last week, the US electorate voted in a new president. The balance of the Senate changed, and it appears that the House will stay in Republican hands. As a result, one party will control both political branches, and the third branch, the judiciary, will also be dominated by a 6-3 Republican-appointed majority. This presents a situation where the president will enjoy tremendous power, much of which may go unfettered, given political and ideological allegiances. There is no shortage of articles and commentary about what this election signifies in terms of a realignment of political parties, and a host of economic, policy, and demographic shifts. For some, this election was a cause for jubilation and vindication. For others, it has been a source of fear and despondency. We are, however, a law school community, a community that is dedicated to learning and teaching and instilling legal skills to become excellent practitioners of the law. And we want to use this critical moment in our nation to explore what are the legal implications of a second Trump presidency. President Trump's first term in office and his transition out of power, as well as his campaign for president, reflect actions, attitudes, and positions that are and have been sometimes in tension with the Constitution and various other legal restraints. Many state rules of professional conduct, including Ohio's, remind us that, quote, lawyers play a vital role in the preservation of society. And as we discuss some of the potential legal consequences of another Trump presidential term, I urge us all, and in particular law students, to think about the role of the lawyer, about what will be their role as a lawyer in working in this nation going forward. Today, we will explore what President Trump has done in various areas of policy and law in his last term, and what he has promised to do in a second term, and what might or might not be possible under the law. Helping us through our discussion, we are privileged to have a number of our own professors who will address 4 distinct areas of law. We'll discuss the rule of law, separation of powers, and democracy, and will be led in that discussion by Professors Jonathan Entin and Ray Koo. In our discussion of civil rights, we'll be led in a discussion by our own Aisha Bell-Hardaway and Professor Jesse Hill, who's joining us remotely. We'll discuss the environment with Professor Victor Flatt. And finally, we'll hear from Professors Stacy Cozart-Martin and Sarah Oku on issues relating to immigration. Each panel will be about 15 minutes of discussion, and then we're going to allow for the balance of time, which should be about a half hour, for discussions from all of you. I remind us, no matter your feelings or emotions, that we talk in a civil and respectful way to one another, and I look forward to a really fruitful and edifying discussion. And so I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan Entin, please.
Thank you, Avi. President Trump and his advisors subscribe to the so-called unitary executive theory, and I'm going to talk a little bit about presidential power in that regard. The unitary executive theory posits that Article II's vesting of the executive power in the president authorizes the president to supervise and direct the work of any official who performs an executive function. And it has implications both at the top of agencies and further down. Start at the top. At least 1,200 civilian, non-judicial federal officials are appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. This process can take a long time, even when the political process works a lot more smoothly than it has been working recently. President Trump has been pressuring Republican senators to meet relatively infrequently at the beginning of his term so that he can make a large number of recess appointments right away, which would be completely unprecedented. In addition to the executive branch departments, we have a number of so-called independent agencies, such as the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the National Labor Relations Board. Members of those agencies serve staggered terms, and the president is legally authorized to remove them only for cause. Trump might well seek to remove some commissioners he doesn't like, people like Lena Khan at the Federal Trade Commission, or Gary Gensler at the Securities and Exchange Commission, or Jerome Powell, whom he appointed as the chair of the Federal Reserve. And he might do this in an effort to try to get the Supreme Court to overrule its 1935 Humphreys executive decision that upheld for-cause removal requirements for members of independent agencies. Now, beyond that, let's get further down, because all agencies have a large number of high and mid-level personnel who do the day-to-day work. Trump has called these people part of the swamp or the deep state, and he might well try to strip civil service protection from these folks and try to fill their position with loyalists. He tried to do this actually at the tail end of his first term. President Biden immediately revoked that, but now Trump is very likely to revisit this. That's what's known as Schedule F. Beyond that, Trump could try a couple of other things. For instance, he could try to locate some agencies far away from Washington and give the people who work in those agencies a very short time, like maybe 2 or 3 weeks, to decide whether to move to the new agency headquarters or to give up their jobs. He tried to do this, by the way, in his first term with the Bureau of Land Management, and an enormous number of people at BLM quit rather than move to a small city in Colorado. Now he's talking about moving a whole lot more agencies out of Washington. Finally, Trump might try to close down some agencies that he doesn't like, maybe by trying to invoke his authority under the Reorganization Act. Now, all of these strategies will generate fierce pushback and probably some lawsuits. He might think that he has a fair chance of winning at least some of these lawsuits, in part because several current members of the Supreme Court have said things suggesting sympathy for the unitary executive theory, and you can see language to that effect in the presidential immunity decision from last term. But even if Trump loses a few, he might still think it's worth taking a very aggressive approach to executive power, because being aggressive might give him some advantages. However all this shakes out, it's going to shape the functioning and the structure of the federal government for years to come. Let me pass things on to Professor Koo to take a look at the bigger picture.
Okay, yeah, so Professor Etten gave you a little more detail here. I want to go about 30,000 feet above all. Right, because given the panel and given our particular topic, the rule of law, I really do want us to ask ourselves, what do we mean, especially as lawyers, the rule of law represents? Right? Because clearly, the president and, as Dean Cover pointed out, what will ultimately be Republican control of both houses of Congress and the large, dominant control of the judiciary and the majority of the Supreme Court. All of this occurred through the stated processes of our Constitution and what we would say is representative of our democratic process. Now, the question, however, is what happens when that process achieves results that might fundamentally be inconsistent and at odds with the principles of the Constitution and what that democracy is supposed to represent. And I think that's what we are fundamentally posed with here, right? It doesn't matter to some extent whether you say it's a left-leaning or right-leaning leader. Tyranny, by many people's definition, would be the same. Those of you who read constitutional law know that I don't believe that. But fundamentally, we are looking at a situation in which the system of checks and balances that are established under the Constitution have led us to the most dangerous place in our constitutional order. Right? So James Madison, writing in the Federalist Papers, said that the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether one, few, or many, whether hereditary or self-appointed or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. And that is the situation we find ourselves in today. Right? So President Trump, when he takes office for his second term, will find himself with a very, very sympathetic Congress. He will find himself with a federal judiciary that has been significantly populated by individuals who have clearly demonstrated a willingness to follow his interpretation of the law as opposed to what precedent might actually suggest, and a Supreme Court with a significant majority that he might very well be able to expand on in the upcoming years. So we are in a situation where the other branches of government are not in the position or have necessarily the inclination to be a check under him in these circumstances. And as Professor Ent was pointing out, another fundamental restraint that we've relied on for so long is the professionalism of public servants, right? Whether appointed or career, right? These are individuals who, in general, to use the kind of rhetoric of our politics, place country above politics, and who look at things like regulating the environment, defending civil rights, from the perspective of what's the science, right? What are the principles that this country has adopted and pronounces? And you know, when those people are our final kind of safeguards and their jobs are threatened, kind of really what's left for us under these circumstances? What I emphasize in my class, right, and one of the most important things I cover is this idea that under our Constitution, one fundamentally important pillar is the protection and at least the attempted recognition and advancement of unalienable rights. Right, but another pillar, arguably the only other major pillar that the Constitution was supposed to uphold, was the prevention of tyranny, especially the rise of an autocracy or a modern-day monarchy. And yet that is very much the logical conclusion of almost essentially 50 years of political pressure, political theory, in changing how we think of what our representative process is supposed to look like, what courts are supposed to do. So for us here briefly, I want you to ask yourself, right, the lawyers in the room and the future lawyers in the room, what you think your role should be. Not simply as people who advocate or argue in terms of what the law can be, right, but what does the law provide? It may very well be that we want to change precedent in one area or another. It's a very different thing to say that we believe that this case might be out of date or that this reasoning may no longer apply, but yet still say the rule of law requires me to uphold it and apply it, even if I don't like the consequences of it. The other will be, well, how well can we use our creative skills? And say, well, I can come up with an argument as to how this might apply. Right? So think presidential immunity. What is an official act of the president? Right? Obviously, if the idea there is a foreign enemy and we want to send troops in to combat a foreign enemy, we would all generally agree historically that that seems to be an appropriate official act of the presidency. If the president decides to define that an enemy is an enemy within the United States, who just happens to be someone who is a critic of his or an opponent of his, just because he calls them an enemy, will that be sufficient? And so many of you may have heard of his efforts to claim the ability to use military on domestic soil. Well, could these be insurrectionists, right? Could these be enemy aliens? Not because we're at war with them or that Congress has declared a war with them, but they are part of some deadly threatening invasion of others, right? And to the extent that lawyers are willing to make those arguments and judges are willing to accept those arguments because there is a thin sliver of possibility or a substance there, I think that is the fundamental threat that as lawyers we have to face. And in the past, this has been a bipartisan concern. Lawyers from both sides of the political aisle have fought for the rule of law, regardless of who the presidents are. I just want to leave you with a couple of maybe hopeful examples here. And unfortunately, as I dig into some of these things, they might not be as hopeful as you might think. The first was a broad story, which arguably is better hypocritically than actually. But some of you may know Stanislav Petrov. He was a Russian lieutenant colonel who during the Cold War was responsible for the early warning systems in the Soviet Union. They received a false error that the United States was launching nuclear missiles against the Soviet Union. And this was actually during a very heated moment after the Russians had shot down a commercial airliner. And he refused to report that launch to superiors. And of course, the concern would be under those heightened circumstances, that report would have been enough to spark a nuclear war and a retaliatory response from the Soviet Union. But he exercised his independent judgment and said, no, this is probably a mistake. I'm going to sit on this because I think as a professional here, this is not something that should be reported. Right, so he exercised his judgment, and many people have concluded that he prevented a major nuclear war from happening. Some of you may be familiar with the Saturday Night Massacre involving Richard Nixon. So this is, for those of you who are about to have me and talking about presidential immunity, this begins with the Nixon tapes, right? The tapes that ultimately became so damning to his impeachment, and the effort of the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, to seek access to those tapes. Right. When Nixon heard about this, his first order was to the Attorney General Richardson, fire Archibald Cox. Richardson, to his credit, said no, right, and resigned. So what happened next? The Deputy Attorney General was given the same order, and he said no and resigned. Right. Ultimately, Nixon found someone who was willing to say yes. That was his Solicitor General at the time, and that's Robert Bork. So some of you may have heard of him through Supreme Court both nominations and confirmations. But that was a process in which Nixon's own people fought back against what they perceived to be an abuse of executive authority. Same thing happened under the Bush administration. There is this crazy story where John Ashcroft is in a hospital recovering from surgery when Alberto Gonzalez wants him to reauthorize what becomes ultimately part of our overall digital surveillance and presidential surveillance program, which we now know fundamentally captured not just telephone metadata, right, like who you called, how long the call was, but internet communications and metadata. And when Gonzalez is rushing there to Ashcroft's sickbed, Comey, the head of the FBI at the time, rushes there as well, and both Comey and Ashcroft say, no, right? And this, we will not authorize this because we believe this program violates the Constitution and the principles of separation of powers, and ultimately we're successful. Right? So there is this very serious role that we can all play as lawyers, whether we'll justify these actions and defend these individuals, as well as hope that these individuals will exist and step up in this administration.
Thank you very much, Jonathan and Ray. We'll have opportunity to go back and think about ways in which the Trump administration may be trying to counteract such independent actions. But let's turn now to the issue of civil rights. And we'll first hear from Professor Jesse Hill.
Thank you, and thanks for accommodating me to appear by Zoom. And sorry that my head is so big. I can tell from where I'm staying, it's a rather large screen. So I want to talk about reproductive rights primarily and access to reproductive health care and the impact that the Trump administration may have on those things. I think there is a potential for a tremendous impact. So just again, as an initial constitutional law lesson or refresher, if the federal government takes an action like passing an abortion ban that applies throughout the country, that federal law supersedes state laws, right? Federal law is supreme over state law. So even if your state constitution, for example, like in Ohio, has constitutional protections for abortion rights, Congress or the federal government can override that. There has been talk about Congress, since again, it is a trifecta, Republican trifecta, there's been talk about Congress potentially passing some sort of nationwide abortion ban or regulation of abortion. Trump said as a candidate that he would veto such a law. I mean, I'm personally skeptical that Congress is going to pass anything like that for a number of reasons that I'm happy to say more about later, but I think that I think it's probably unlikely. I also think it's probably by and large unnecessary because there is already a federal law on the books called the Comstock Act that is simply not being enforced right now, and that the Trump administration could enforce and probably will enforce in some form that could have the same effect as a nationwide abortion ban, or at least a very severe restriction on abortion. So the Comstock Act is a law that was passed back in 1873, and like I said, is still on the books. It prohibits shipping or mailing or receiving through shipment or mailing anything designed, adapted, or intended for producing abortion. This law is a federal law, and it was not enforced for many decades, particularly when Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey were the law of the land protecting a right to abortion. Even when it was enforced, it had been interpreted by federal courts to mean that mailing these materials were illegal only if the sender knew that they were going to be used in an illegal abortion, and that the abortion that they were going to be used in was in fact illegal. So it has been interpreted narrowly. However, there has been a desire by some of the folks who are, who have supported Trump and who have, and including in the Project 2025, to renew enforcement of this federal law. And so it's just up to the executive branch to decide, tomorrow, not tomorrow, but the day after the inauguration, the Trump DOJ could simply announce that it's going to start enforcing this law. The question is, how will it function? Will it actually function as a nationwide abortion ban because you simply can't send anything that can be used to perform an abortion and everything gets shipped through the mail? That is definitely one possibility. Another possibility is that it will be used to target the medication mifepristone, which is used to produce abortions. It's an abortion medication that is used early in pregnancy to produce an abortion, and is currently, again, that's how people get things. That's how clinics get things. That's how, and it's also people in ban states that have abortion bans are currently able through internet services to access medication abortion through the mail as well, and by ordering it essentially on the internet through various services. And so I think there's a very strong likelihood that at a minimum, that medication will become targeted and may become largely unavailable throughout the US. Maybe some international companies will continue to ship it in, unclear. Or, there has already been litigation in which conservative groups have argued that the FDA's approval of the medication was improper because it didn't take account of the Comstock Act, or that loosening restrictions and allowing mailing of this medication is improper because of the Comstock Act. So there's various litigation in which this issue has also come up, and it could happen that way as well. Just a couple of other things to keep an eye on. So that's abortion medication. I think access to that is very much at risk under a new Trump administration. Other than that, there has been litigation around something called EMTALA, which requires abortions to be provided in emergency rooms when that is the only stabilizing treatment for a patient. Some states have challenged that to the extent that it conflicts with their own state abortion bans. Sorry. I expect the Trump administration to pull back on any interpretation that would suggest that state law could not be followed, that abortions have to be provided in conflict with state law. So in other words, I think there will not be as many. There's litigation around this right now. I think the litigation will go away because state laws will sort of be allowed to be enforced in those circumstances. Finally, another thing to watch with respect to abortion is a federal program called Title IX, which, and it actually has broader implications than abortion, is a federally funded family planning program. The Trump administration, the last time, had put out a rule that said that you could not provide options counseling in those programs, that included telling people about abortion or how to access it or give referrals for abortion. There was litigation over that rule that was sort of still ongoing when the Biden administration came in and rolled the rule back. I expect that the Trump administration will put it back in place. When that rule was in effect, it caused numerous Planned Parenthoods to pull out of the Title X program altogether because they felt that they could not practice, medicine in that way where they couldn't share full information and comprehensive counseling with patients. So what that meant was a lot of Planned Parenthoods stopped providing not just abortion services, but access to contraception, preventive health services, and so on, because they were essentially pushed out of this program. That, and then finally, one last word I'll just say about reproductive rights and health is also contraceptive access could also come into question. There has been talk about repealing the Affordable Care Act, which mandates that employers provide insurance for contraception. There has also been talk of a rule that would require parental notice for minors who are seeking across the country, for minors who are seeking access to contraception through these Title X programs. And finally, one last thing affecting reproductive health and privacy actually is that the Biden administration put out rules that protect reproductive health information for people who travel into different states to access it, saying that basically you can't get information about care that was legal in the state where it was provided. You can't get that information for law enforcement purposes. Again, that was an administrative rule that I would fully expect the Trump administration to just pull back. So I'll stop there because I've already talked too long, I think.
Thank you, Jesse. We'll turn it over to Aisha.
Hi. Where to start? So we're going to talk about policing and some of the threads around the Insurrection Act and the like are relevant here. But I want to first start with local policing, especially since we sit in Cleveland where there is a consent decree for its local police department. We know in the first Trump administration that Trump and Jeff Sessions looked at consent decrees. Consent decrees are actions brought by the Department of Justice through the Attorney General by the Department of Justice for police departments that are found to have engaged in patterns or practices of unconstitutional policing under section, what's now recodified under section 12601. And Jeff Sessions, pretty early in his tenure in 2017, in March, I believe, of 2017, puts out this memorandum that essentially professes allegiance to local police departments and their ability to manage the issues in their jurisdictions. That was important and a big signal because months before that, during the transition from the Obama presidency to the Trump presidency, there were two consent decrees that were pending to be entered. Well, one that was pending to be entered and one that was newly entered. Chicago and Baltimore. And we saw the Trump Department of Justice immediately tried to renege on the department, on the Baltimore consent decree for which the judge would not let them renege. But because the decree had not been entered in Chicago, they successfully reneged on that one. And unfortunately for the citizens of Chicago and Illinois, they had an attorney general that was willing to bring a state-driven or state-generated consent decree action against that locality. Since Trump has not been in office, we've seen additional, obviously, heinous acts of police violence against community members in the streets. And the Attorney General under Merrick Garland with Special Counsel or First Chair Kristen Clark and Vanita Gupta have moved forward on consent decrees in Minneapolis following the killing of George Floyd, in Louisville following the death and the killing of Breonna Taylor, and now with findings recently released out of Memphis following the killing and the beating death of Tyree Nichols by that strike force rogue gang unit that operated within the Memphis Police Department. And we know that the Attorney General's office, the Department of Justice, has been willing even to go to small places, right? They just recently released findings out of a place called Lexington, Mississippi, related to some really atrocious practices there. We know that Trump is no fan of police reform. At best, Jeff Sessions took the position that there were bad apples, that's at best, right? That result in a culture of unconstitutional, abusive police practices. But we also know what Trump says on the record as it relates to the need to have a tough on crime approach. This is true despite the fact that violent crime is down and has been down for a significant period of time. But nonetheless, the rhetoric allowed, obviously, for him to win the popular vote, this and several other reasons. And so he will undoubtedly pick up where he left off, with restricting the efforts of police reform through the use of Section 12601. That's important. I mean, so in the places where the consent decrees exist, right, I will tell you as somebody who worked very closely with the Department of Justice on the Cleveland consent decree, the plaintiff in the case is the Department of Justice, and they have a very different posture when their boss is Donald Trump. It puts an undue burden on the monitors in that role to act instead of a monitor, but instead as a plaintiff. And it places the cities in a position where, depending upon what their druthers are, right, they get to skate without really working to see through the promises that they made in the original agreement. I don't say that lightly, but I say that from experience. That is the reality of what happens when Trump is in office and there are consent decrees at stake. With that being said, consent decrees are not the end all be all, I think, around transforming policing. But any efforts that we had to move towards transformative police practices through the use of consent decrees and other community-driven actions, right? We now have Trump in office, and we know that he won't support it. Instead, after during the 2020 uprisings, and this is where this Insurrection Act and the National Guard and all of the other pieces and parts come in. We know that in Washington, D.C., he called out the National Guard to respond to unrest on the streets of D.C. We also know that even though they were unmarked and without identification, in unmarked vehicles and without identification, that federal agents were on the streets of Portland, Oregon, and taking people into custody in places where they were where folks did not know where they were or how to get access to them for lengthy periods of time. Those were federal officers that were doing that, right? Just as I was about to write a paper around the need to make federal law enforcement more accountable as a follow-up to Biden's executive order that he released in 2022, calling for reformed police practices, use of force, increased accountability, data transparency, and all of those pieces and parts, right? We're now at a place where I'm sure he will roll back Biden's executive order. I have it here. What is it? Executive Order 14074 from March 25th of 2022. The agencies were just starting supposedly to collect data that I wanted to see some evidence of, and I'm certain that it will dissipate into thin air. The concern around the National Guard, if I could just really quickly on this piece, right, that Professor Koo brought up, this concern around the National Guard and the use of them, right? We might think that, well, it's the National Guard, and so as long as state agencies or state governments don't don't call for their troops to be used in that way, that somehow that will prevent it. No, because they are connected to the federal Army and the federal Air Force. And as a result of that, I don't put it beyond anyone, especially as we see how this cabinet is shaping up. I don't put it above anyone to make a call to the state National Guard invoking their national connection as it relates to, we know about protesting, but who he deems to be an enemy within, whether those are people with what he deems to be illegal status in this country or otherwise, I think is of great concern. The last thing I will say is the death penalty, because we can't ignore this piece or part of this, right? As it relates to the death penalty, in his last months in office, President Trump ordered the execution of 13 federal prisoners at a clip greater than any others had ever seen in the history of the American presidencies. And the reality of that was that 7 of those 13 people were Black. There were 7 Black people and 1 Native American woman, right, that he executed very, very quickly while there were claims of innocence still on the table for some, and while there were questions about mental capacity and competency on the table. And there has been a moratorium on that. Merrick Garland had put a pause on that. But with the end of a Biden presidency, we should assume that federal executions will resume, despite concern about the torturous nature of them, or whether or not the people are actually rightfully convicted. I'll stop there. I hope I did okay. I don't know, did I? Sorry.
Thank you, Professor Hill and Bell Hardaway. We're gonna now turn to the issue of immigration. Professors Stacey Kozar Martin and Sarah Oku. Begin with Stacey.
So, as many of you know, the Trump rhetoric during the campaign trail was heavy hitting on immigration. A lot of the other issues that we talked about already seem to be a lot of what ifs and maybe nots, right? I think that unfortunately for immigration, we may be the hardest hit under this administration, and I feel as if we were probably the hardest hit under the prior administration as well. Yeah, true. So when Trump was president previously, we operated under a lot of executive orders, and every day we would come into the office and be like, okay, well, today I guess we're doing this, because yesterday we were doing that, but now we're not anymore. We're going to be doing this, right?
472, so about 1 every 3 days or so.
So unfortunately, I think for our practice, it's going to severely impact those who are both here undocumented, as well as those are here under a lawful status. So we wanted to talk about kind of the areas that we think might be impacted the most. Obviously, his campaign was mass deportation, right? We're gonna somehow figure out how to deport 13 million people who are here in the US who are undocumented, and Sarah will talk about that a little bit more in a moment. He also, as both professors have talked about, wants to use the military to secure the US border. He wants to extend the border wall, which was so effective previously. He also wants to modify the way that those asylum seekers are eligible to seek asylum in the US by reinstated in the Remain in Mexico program. Most likely will end temporary protective status, although according to the administration, that's not really a lawful status anyway in the US. As of, I think last night, he was tweeting again about ending birthright citizenship and most likely will reinstate the Muslim bans, the travel bans. And then finally, we'll probably again limit the number of refugees who are admitted to the US. So I'll let Sarah talk a little bit more about the mass deportation.
We're gonna go back and forth a bit as we plan. So on the topic of mass deportation, obviously this was a huge campaign issue. And as Stacy mentioned, estimates between 11 to 13 million undocumented individuals already in the United States, right? So that's not including anyone who's attempting entry, largely through the southern border with Mexico, but other ports of entry as well. And while there's fear among that community in particular, something we were discussing before the panel is that even our clients who are documented, who have some form of valid status at this time, are also quite concerned about what the Trump administration will mean for their existing forms of status. Stacey mentioned in particular with TPS, that is a valid form of legal status that has a great deal of uncertainty. And individuals who apply for TPS are quite concerned that they'll be caught up in this mass deportation. In terms of checks on this plan for net mass deportation, there are, of course, some legal concerns, and all of this will certainly be challenged in the various courts. The largest checks on this plan are monetary and just in terms of sheer infrastructure. We do not have the infrastructure. We do not have the existing deportation machine to do what the Trump administration. I believe I have the numbers somewhere. I was at an event recently, which the Cleveland Immigration Court, which is one of many immigration courts throughout the country. Cleveland currently has over 55,000 cases pending with only 12 judges. An individual who is going to be deported needs to make their way through that system. At least under our current system of the law, individuals have the right to due process in removal proceedings, something that we will certainly see attempts to erode. One of the things that the Trump administration did the first time around was implement the use of so-called rocket dockets, which essentially expedites the removal process and really strips away a lot of the due process protections that are available to immigrants who are in the removal process. Things like right to counsel, which is actually a guaranteed right that individuals have in removal proceedings. That right becomes pretty non-existent when you're going to have a start to finish removal process in 20 days. And you're going to do it from a detention cell, right? So good luck finding an attorney to represent you. By the way, at no cost to the government, so paying for an attorney to represent. Just in terms of the sheer budget that something like this would require, estimates are all over the place. But even kind of the more conservative estimates say that within the first year, this would cost over $100 billion for the Trump administration to implement. And to actually get the wheels moving, get this up and running, we're likely looking at least 10 years to actually get a system like this in place. And so as I mentioned, the largest checks on this won't necessarily be legal, although of course that would be part of the analysis. There'll be more budgetary, practical consideration.
Right, and I think that kind of plays into using the military to protect the borders. Right now, the Customs and Border Patrol agency is tasked with securing our borders. And the Biden administration had put in some safeguards to minimize the impact of people coming into the US. But using, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to have the US military protect our own borders is something that I think will be cause for litigation and has never been done in the past.
And I should note too, not just at the border, but actually using this internally as well to administer these detention camps. The last time that this was really invoked in a serious way was during World War II. Japanese internment, hardly a right chapter in our. But that's the legal authority that this administration will be looking to, not only to enforce things along the southern border, but internally as well.
And then, building the wall again, so we took federal funding, changed the appropriations. There's 2,000 miles of the wall currently. When he was, prior administration, he built about 500 miles, and that included new as well as repairing old. So I'm not quite sure how monetarily, if he's running the mass deportation ring that he's proposed, how you're gonna have further money to build an additional wall.
Mexico's in.
Exactly, we paid for it last time, right?
Yeah.
And so, again, just like the mass deportation, fiscally, how is that gonna be feasible for the US to be able to support that? And then the asylum program, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and so obviously, again, during the campaign, one of the main places that we saw a lot of criticism from the campaign was on the asylum process, which, I'll note that asylum is not just codified in US law, it's also part of many international treaties that the US is required to follow. Asylum is a legal mechanism for pursuing status in the United States. Individuals who are seeking asylum in the United States while they are seeking that form of status. But we do expect to see a lot of resources put into challenging the asylum system. Both for those who are already here, but as well as basically foreclosing the ability to apply for asylum at the US-Mexico border. We saw this during the first Trump administration. Quite frankly, the Biden administration also did a lot of this, right? And in fact, a lot of the legal groundwork that the Trump administration used the first time around was actually established by the Obama administration, the use of executive orders to do things. And so there's unfortunately a pretty substantial precedent for in history for implementing these types of things. We also, I don't know how many of you saw as you were coming in today, we just learned that Matt Gaetz has been appointed as the Attorney General, or will be appointed, I should say. The Attorney General. Yeah. I don't remember when she told me I. The Attorney General has enormous authority in the area of immigration. The Attorney General can essentially certify a decision to themselves in order to issue a precedential decision that's then binding.
And has in the past.
Jeff Sessions used this prolifically. We expect that the new Attorney General will do the same. Can actually go back to cases that are settled law and say, I want to recertify that to myself and attack that again and completely change precedential authority. We expect to see that used very heavily in asylum to foreclose things like gender-based asylum claims, gang-based asylum claims, anything, and perhaps, domestic violence, perhaps I'm letting my bias show through here a bit, but really if you're coming from a country that is a majority non-white country, expect to see some executive action that forecloses asylum options from those countries. So it's going to be a wild ride.
For sure. Also, I'm sure you're all familiar with, eating the cats and dogs, right? All those undocumented immigrants in Springfield were actually on temporary protective status, or TPS, right? Which is regulated by the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security and can be invoked when there's a natural disaster or extraordinary circumstances or conditions in one's country or ongoing armed conflict, right? So we have the discretion to allow individuals from those countries to enter the US, be here lawfully, enter lawfully, and have the ability to work. This is probably, I would think, one of the benefits that's going to be eliminated fairly quickly. So there are 16 countries right now that have temporary protective status, and potentially before the election, Lebanon was also supposed to be grandfathered or allowed in under the temporary protective status as well for nationals from Lebanon. My guess is that probably will not go forward, and the ones that we currently have will be repealed back, some of which have been in existence since the 90s, right? So again, a benefit that allows people to come into the US and work probably will no longer be available. And then ending birthright citizenship. So it is a constitutional amendment that if you have a parent here, regardless of status, if your child is born in the US, they are a United States citizen. The Trump administration has proposed to basically get rid of that amendment and change it so that only if one of your parents is a lawful permanent resident, which means you have a green card, or a US citizen, then your child can derive citizenship. Otherwise, if you have two undocumented parents, the child will not, excuse me, be a United States citizen, which then ends the ability for the child when they become 21 to sponsor their parents for immigration benefits, right? So it kind of cuts off not only the benefits to the child, but to the benefits long-term to the family as a whole and keeping the family together.
Kind of, yeah, similarly, I mean, it's interesting the ways in which the administration plans to attack children in particular, kind of as a mechanism for inducing self-deportations, kind of encouraging people to leave the United States unilaterally on their own. Because in addition to targeting birthright citizenship, we've seen the Trump administration talk about things like essentially going after file where we go and trying to make it so that undocumented children cannot attend public education institutions in the United States, including elementary, high school, secondary school. We've seen kind of talk about detaining U.S. citizen children with their family members who are in this mass deportation system. And legal authority that allows for the detention of U.S. citizens. Or codes with parents can making hard choices so that parents are kind of forced into not asserting their due process rights and essentially conceding to. And then we're likely to see kind of the reincarnation of some of the more ideologically driven entry bans. So people who are attempting to come to the United States with visas from other countries. We saw the various iterations of the Muslim ban during the first Trump administration. There's been talk of expanding that to other non-Muslim countries where, again, you have a majority non-white population. So we've seen talk about doing this in countries like Haiti. So again, just seeing kind of unilateral across the board, no entries whatsoever on any kind of visa, no matter whether it's legal or not, if you are from a certain country of origin.
Exactly. So even if you were a physician here working on an H-1B, which happened to us, and we had our physicians leave the country for travel purposes to visit family back home or whatever that was, the travel ban went into effect and it was immediate. So we did not get family members back into the U.S., which were usually the primary breadwinners, right? So you had the primary breadwinner outside the U.S. because they didn't travel with their family. Rest of the family stuck here in the U.S. with the inability to go because then they wouldn't be able to come back. So it broke apart families. It broke apart, the primary breadwinner trying to support their families here in the U.S. And this was all legal immigration, right? And then the last thing I think that probably will be attacked is the limit on refugees who can come into the U.S. So the annual limit is 100,000. The previous administration cut it down first to 50,000, and then he cut it down to 15,000, and I think we almost got to zero at some points. He has ultimate control of the refugee admissions per year and the annual limit. So my guess is because of the countries that they might be coming from, we may lose the ability to resettle refugees into the U.S. And what this ultimately caused was resettlement agencies to shut down. And I think in just Ohio alone, we lost 5 to 7 resettlement agencies because they just didn't have the funds or the people to resettle. So it impacted the economy as well. So
We could go on.
We could.
We should defer.
Thank you. We're going to turn to now the issue of environment and hear from Professor Victor Flatt.
Well, I suppose the one thing I can say about the environmental changes that are coming, environmental issues are, with one sort of an exception, are not really in the sort of personal animosity of President Trump per se. And that's quite different from issues about groups that he may or may not like. And so we have a bit of a somewhat more traditional Democrat to Republican switch here than we would have than compared to a lot of these other things. That said, there is one particular area that we may see some more dramatic changes. So the things of all of the things that I think will happen with environmental law, I want to put them in three buckets. One is enforcement. The second is changes in specific laws and regulations, and the third is related to private sector and how they deal with the environmental policies. First of all, enforcement. This is an easy one. This is typical. I think it'll be a little bit greater with Trump. Typically, money for personnel for the EPA, for Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Interior gets cut. Between the Democratic and Republican administration, not always, but typically that happens. We saw in the first Trump administration that not only were the budgets cut, but many of the issues dealing with who can be hired and what their status is in terms of civil service, et cetera, were left a lot of personnel that work at these agencies unhappy, uncomfortable. The job satisfaction at the EPA was at its lowest in the first Trump administration. It is currently rebounded before the election up to near the highest. So I expect that to go down a great deal. A lot of people will leave. Trump is talking about moving EPA's headquarters out of Washington, D.C. to possibly Texas or Florida. So there's going to just be less enforcement. And enforcement's always a problem. Democrat, Republican administration, there's never quite enough to get the job done that supposedly the laws are required to be done. I'm going to come back just briefly to one example of that in the end. Changes in laws and regulations, you can divide that into sort of two buckets. There's the climate things, and then what I would call sort of more legacy environmental laws. If you look at sort of the more legacy environmental laws, your traditional Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, hazardous materials, toxics, et cetera, we have advanced, finally, after having these laws in the books 50 years, so many rules and regulations have gone into effect and so many changes have been made on the ground that we will still have cleaner air in general, water, soil, than we probably would have had 25 years ago, even with a new administration. There's not been any particular animosity the Trump administration has expressed towards sort of quote unquote clean air, clean water, that sort of thing. Now, in views of what that means may vary. What we won't see, I think, are new ratcheting down of health-based standards. So that's required in our environmental laws every 5 years. These have to be revisited. They're always delayed. They get delayed more in general in Republican administrations, and I think in the Trump administration, they will just be basically ignored. But I don't think we'll see enormous backsliding on that, except with wetlands, and that was happening anyway. That's a difficult issue with the Supreme Court. And then the issues surrounding legacy environmental issues and climate. And climate is the big thing in the room. It's the one thing that the Trump administration, and President Trump in particular, has expressed a lot of dissatisfaction with. Again, I don't think he wants to live in a world where the climate is altered and it's unlivable. But because of the way political alliances are, it becomes a bit of a bet noir. So what we can see most definitely actions are attempts to roll back rules and regulations dealing with protecting the climate. In terms of regulations, we have many new Clean Air Act standards for large sources of greenhouse gases that are finally going into play. Expect those, they're an attempt to roll those back. And that would require, for those in leg reg or admin law, it requires a new rule proposed, notice of comment, second, et cetera. The Trump administration was very unsuccessful in their rollbacks in the first administration. I think that was because they didn't have a lot of people that understood how that process worked. It may be slightly different this time. But those will be challenged. I mean, they'll be challenged, and precisely because when you change or take a rule back or reverse it, you still have to provide a reasoned explanation. So to the extent they are unable to do that, that may slow it down. But these new power plant rules, et cetera, will be targeted. You will also likely target what are known as methane rules. These are rules to control methane extraction and how it's done, and how it's wasted, and how it's flared. The only potential hold on that is actually a lot of industry wants some form of the methane rules. It's necessary for their competitive advantage in a business sense around the world. Most of the rest of the world, the US is exporting large amounts of liquefied natural gas now. The rest of the world wants only to get natural gas that it deems to be more climate friendly. And so to the extent rules are rolled back in the US, that will suppress the demand for US product around the world. So a lot of business wants some kind of rule. I don't know whether or not the Trump administration will pay attention to that. That leaves us, last bucket is the private sector and environmental laws. And the big thing there are private companies' policies with respect to environment, social, and governance ideas. And certainly Trump has said he is an antagonist of the so-called ESG movement. Elon Musk has called the ESG movement the devil. And so definitely expect a push to rescind the Securities and Exchange Commission's rule on greenhouse gas reporting. No doubt about that. There will probably be a push to alter ERISA legislatively, and they may have the power to do it, so that it will prohibit the consideration of governance, social, or environmental capacities for retirement funds. The problem with that, of course, is that these considerations, typically in the US at least, they're only legal to the extent they actually are reflective of the business impacts of these. And so that's going to be a problematic thing. When Texas instituted its anti-ESG rules, it's estimated that it's cost the state approximately $1 billion in extra fees because of not using certain banks that they deem to be unfriendly to the fossil fuel industry. And so we could see that would be a major change. And if they are able to change ERISA, I'm sorry, it's a Employee Retirement Insurance Security Act, yeah. So the idea that governs all your insurance policies, right? There's a federal law that governs how those things can be invested, how they're disclosed, et cetera. If that passes, that might even have a worldwide implication. Otherwise, the US's views on anti-ESG will be in divergence with the rest of the world. The rest of the world is moving one way. The US is now definitely going to move this way. That is problematic for US companies. Again, many US companies do not want that because it's problematic for them to have to satisfy all these multiple standards going forward. Just as the last thing I'll say, an example of enforcement and laws and regulations coming together that we will see more of is that the Biden administration, for the first time, I think, really seriously tried to implement environmental justice policies to actually protect very vulnerable communities, either racial minority communities or low-income communities, from facing enormous, particularly hard, heavier burdens of pollution. And they really have made some significant movement in that area. But just last week, saw an example where under laws and regulations, they came up with a new rule for air toxics to ratchet down a particularly toxic chemical because the exposure levels were very high in what's known as Cancer Alley in Louisiana. The Biden administration said if they can't, this one company cannot reduce, they're going to have to shut down. The state of Louisiana pushed back, fought against it. Their Department of Environmental Quality fought against it. That's in court. In the interim, the state finally simply decided to close the school that was near there and disperse the students to avoid any more of that. And so that's kind of a combination of a rule that should be trying to go into effect, but the enforcement part pushing back against that. So anything I think that, and I do think that's an area under traditional environmental law where real progress has been made, is trying to cut back on the environmental exposures of particularly vulnerable groups. And I think that will definitely be pushed backwards or reversed. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Victor Black. So I want to thank all of you for a lot of information, unfortunately, a lot of disheartening information. And I guess before we turn it over to everyone, I guess I wonder if any of you have, I don't want false hope, but I guess in particular for law students here, what role can law students start playing even right now to address some of these issues, and then in terms of planning career-wise internships? John?
Let me point to a picture over here on the wall. Fred Gray. Fred Gray graduated from this law school in 1954. He was born and raised in Montgomery, Alabama at the height of segregation. And while he was in college, and let's be clear, this was before Brown against Board of Education. It was at a time when there had been no federal civil rights legislation of any kind in more than 75 years. Black people could not vote. They were severely limited in the kinds of jobs that they could hold, where they could live. We're talking about a feudal system. While he was in college, Fred Gray decided that he was going to become a lawyer and destroy everything segregated he could find. That's a quote. He came up here to law school, and he went home, and he represented Rosa Parks when she was arrested on the bus. He represented Martin Luther King as he became the leader of the movement in Montgomery and later on. Fred Gray is 93 years old, and he still goes to the office at least 2 or 3 days a week. And I count it as one of the great privileges of my life to count Mr. Gray as a friend. But I point to this not because Fred Gray is my friend, I'm pretty trivial in the grand scheme of things, but to suggest that Fred Gray came of age in a very bleak time. And it's not like he will tell you that things got to be great. But people like Fred Gray had enough faith in the law and the legal system and the ability of people who felt oppressed to do something to help themselves and to have the law work with them. So I think that as bleak as the situation may appear today, and I do not mean to undercut the concerns that any of us have raised, but I think that despair is not an option. I don't know exactly how we get there any more than Fred Gray knew at any point during his career how they were going to get from where they were to the next place. But I think we ought to take Fred Gray as an inspiration, as somebody who shows us what lawyers who are really committed to being effective, what they can do.
Can I just build off of that very briefly? You mentioned something that I wanted to say this before. This is not the worst of times. Let me just say that. For most of our nation's history, the majority of people lived in without legal status at all. And in fact, we didn't even have a multiracial democracy that was effective and throughout most of the country, at least until 50 plus 60 years ago. And so, for all that we talk about the great America and all these things, there have been ideals and dreams, but we are definitely, in that sense, in a better situation. More people are than used to be 100 years ago. And I think one of the reasons for that is because the way the country was constructed, they made it very difficult to do things. Very difficult to amend the Constitution, very difficult to change laws, very difficult to get through all 3 houses. Yes, we have a moment where we have 3 branches of government that seem to be in one party more in control, but if you actually look at Congress, Congress is actually very closely split. The Senate is maybe 52-53. It's not fully clear they will be able to hold discipline to pass particular laws. That's also true, I think, in the House. And so I don't believe that the president will move outside of constitutional bounds, or at least he may try, but things will come back legally. What can you do? Every law student I tell this, law is the answer. The rule of law is what makes this potential work. And if nothing else, I would encourage everybody, we're gonna see a flurry of proposed legislation come out in the new Congress. It's gonna be close to passing or not passing. Most congressional members want to get reelected. And that may even trump their loyalty to their party or to a particular individual. If they get 100 to 200 letters from people who are constituents in their district that vote, they actually pay attention. That's such a small number. But that requires everybody boning up and figuring out what's going on and what's happening and educating yourselves on that. Not probably fine.
All right, I don't want to throw total cold water over one professor.
I may be living in a fantasy world.
No, not, right, that's the first, to both of their comments, right? Even before Frederick Douglass, right? A man who was himself enslaved, who escaped and became one of the greatest, most eloquent abolitionists in our country, viewed the Constitution as, in his words, a glorious liberty document. Right? And I think that's what helps this country. That is perhaps what often gets lost in our politics. It's these guiding principles that even the people who voted for Trump, many of them would absolutely accept these principles. It's fundamental to our country. I wouldn't say most, but many, right? But yeah, because that's what gets lost, and we need to emphasize how things like gerrymandering makes your petition to your local member of Congress virtually meaningless. Right? My congressman hasn't met with a single constituent in 8 years, right? Because he doesn't need to, right? The concern over Matt Gaetz being Attorney General, well, shouldn't we rely on the Senate for, advice and consent there? Well, not if they decide to let that slide and say, okay, for him, it's a recess appointment. Right? Or any number of these issues where we've seen it worse, but this is also pretty bad. Right? And I tell my students all the time, this room would not look like this room 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. Here are fundamentally different, and we need to make it clear if you don't believe this is the process, even if you believe the outcomes are what they are, that this process is fundamentally flawed. That's where we can fight and should fight.
No,
Jesse, how about you?
Hey, even Nazi Germany, they fought back. At the end.
We're fighting back, but no expectation.
Jesse?
So I'm not sure I have much to add to all these great comments. I mean, I think, I appreciated Jonathan Enton's points about Fred Gray, and just like in moments like this, I try to remind myself, like, it took 100 years after the Civil War for Black people to get the vote in this country, for real. And like, these are not, this is a long fight. And so it's not something that just, you can snap your fingers, where we may not be used to thinking in those kind of time horizons, right? But it can take time. The only other thing I would add about like how to think about this, and kind of jumping on to Ray's points, I mean, I think, like, we can do a lot at the local level, and I think that the state and local level, and to think about, it's we get very distracted, or all the attention is on the presidency and what's going on in the federal government right now, and it's obviously extremely important and affects our lives, but like, you can do a lot of good, like in your school board and running for local office, and just sort of working to elect a person, a good person to a, state legislative seat, and so on. And granted, again, there are barriers, but there's also a lot more possibility for action, and a lot more, like, it is easier to make change at the state and local level, as an, starting out, or as an individual, or as a group. So just something I would urge you to consider.
Yeah, I'll say, Stacy and I are both adjuncts, and so day to day, we're practitioners more than we are professors. And so I kind of tend to follow where Professor Bell mentioned that she is, which is that I don't necessarily have a whole lot of hope, but I do have the ability to dig in. And I'm going to make a difference in my clients' cases, in their lives. And that does give me that sense of hope. This morning had a client who was granted asylum. That got me through a good chunk of my morning.
Yeah.
You know, that's,
And I would say find your passion and connect to the community that supports your passion,
Yeah.
because Sarah and I have been doing this a long time, and sometimes you want to give up. And then I see your faces every Wednesday night, and I remember there's a fight left in all of us, right? So come remind us that there's a fight left. If you want to do immigration, connect with us. There's tons of work to be done. You can volunteer with us even as students. We will help you. There's going to be more work to come. So whatever your passion is, find it and connect to the community.
Okay, let's hear, thank you, everyone. Let's hear from both. We got microphones, please just wait, so you get ones.
Hi, my name's Allie. It's an immigration question. Of which I have many, but I'll keep it to one. Biden proposed pathways for DACA recipients to gain legal permanent residency. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of the Trump presidency on the DACA program and DACA recipients in general?
I feel like DACA's probably gonna be the first thing cut. I mean, it's been on the chopping block for
already,
a
but,
while.
yeah.
They haven't been accepting new applications for years, so I don't think that there's gonna be anything that I can foresee as a benefit from DACA recipients.
And for those who don't know, DACA is a form of deferred action, where you're not actually, the administration isn't actually granting affirmative status to these individuals. They're just saying, we agree not to deport you and we'll let you work while you're here. And this is for the Dreamer community, individuals who were brought to the United States as children, who have achieved at least a high school level of education or higher, who don't have a serious criminal record, all sorts of merits, the kinds of things we look for. And this program has been essentially dead for years. And so if we can't even get deferred action pathways to lawful status, I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of hope for that under this administration. Hopefully down the road, but not under this administration.
Hello, everyone. Earlier today, Matt Gaetz has been nominated as Attorney General, as mentioned earlier. Gaetz has been notorious, has been a member of the House of Representatives. He has endorsed the white nationalist Great Replacement theory, attended political rallies where the Proud Boys were present, and also criticized Black athletes who protested against systemic racism in the United States. If the Senate confirms Matt Gaetz, which most likely will happen, unfortunately, what do you see on the horizon with the operation of the United States Department of Justice, and especially within the Civil Rights Division?
Is this maybe me? So my friends that work at the Department of Justice, I imagine, right, won't have the confidence of many of them. So there are folks who go to the Department of Justice as sort of like, they're not lifelongers, right, or career DOJ folks. Much of the work that happens at DOJ continues across administrations because of the career DOJ people, right? But what we know about the vindictiveness and the hyper paranoia, perhaps, of Trump after the results of his first administration, at least everybody in his camp is talking right now about how he's going to be very sure to pick people who are loyal and to keep people who are loyal around him. And so I can't imagine what it will be like for my friends at DOJ, right, who have been very out in front around addressing issues of hate and prosecuting hate crimes and the like. That's not going to be a place for them anymore. And like we saw before with DOJ career folks, they left and went to, let's say, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, right? You have a lot of people who leave and go to other organizations to do the meaningful work that they can do. And so that is a reality that happened in the first administration that I imagine will happen during this administration. What that means for Black people, brown people, gay, trans, and queer folks walking around on the streets, right, is probably, I said to someone earlier today about the ways in which my status as a Black woman walking around in the world after 2016 felt unsafe, unlike anything I ever experienced before. And it wasn't because Matt Gaetz or Jeff Sessions or whoever was there. It was because I was on a plane with a person who decided to just laser focus in on my face and say the most crazy things to me, right? Or I'm in the line at the grocery store, and people just have this desire and this license, right, to say and do whatever they want. Because of the values of the people who are leading the country. And so that's a thread here that we haven't even touched on yet today. And I think a signal like Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, right, will mean a lot to the white supremacists, the white nationalists, the fear mongers, the other thing we haven't talked about today on this long arc from the end of slavery until the civil rights movement is the domestic terrorism that destroyed Black communities throughout this country. And I am under no disillusion, right, that amount of violence can actually be revisited against people. Whether they're under the guise of deporting them, right, or just taking back what they want, right? And so I think that reality is something that we haven't talked about either yet today. And yes, it requires everybody to want to stay in the fight and be present for it. But we also have to understand and recognize that a majority of the voters last week voted for this. And so, right, as Black and brown people standing in the space, we have to wonder who's standing with us.
Yeah, so my friends at DOJ,
Yeah, what do they say?
they're anticipating losing their jobs. Right? They are anticipating being fired, reassigned, or some other process a couple of years before they can vest for retirement, because they are not going to be in a position, and they know they are not in the position to switch from protecting individuals who are suffering from discrimination to be in a position of the government reinforcing that discrimination. And bizarre thing from me as a privacy guy, I actually recommend everyone have more cameras. Because as we've seen as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement most recently, video, while yeah, AI can help modify that, video is a lot harder for people to turn away from, and a lot harder for people to kind of deny the existence of those events. People, honest, good people, including people who voted for Trump because they said, look, this economy sucks, and it does. If you're a working class person, if your income is created by your hands, this has not been working for you for a long time, as many people in this room know from their personal experience or their family experience. And those are people who would not want to see that. Those are exactly the same people who questioned police brutality, but when we saw video of men dying because of police brutality, that changed the public consciousness. So
For a moment.
for a moment.
For a moment.
For a moment.
We related to people leaving DOJ. One thing I think Jonathan mentioned this, but Trump really is talking about repealing the entire Civil Service Act.
Yeah.
And what that would mean if it happened, I have a hard time imagining it could happen legislatively. That I have no idea, but there's some damage that could be done through administrative work as well. And what that essentially means is the people that work in the federal government won't be career people. They'll be loyalists.
Yeah.
They may or may not be qualified, but they will be, and this is not seen as a good way to run a country. But if you want absolute loyalty, you want people there that will do what you want them to do. And there still are checks and balances under the law, but it's much harder to do that.
Hello, Michael. I have a question for the immigration panelists. With total non-citizen criminal convictions by type, as published by U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, including assaults, burglaries, robberies, homicides, drug possessions, trafficking, sexual offenses, being greater in every year in the Biden administration, rather than instead of the Trump administration, can you steal any argument for allowing these criminal non-citizens to remain in the country?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? Can you repeat the beginning of your question?
Yeah, so total non-citizen criminal convictions by type has increased in the Biden administration in every year, more than the Trump administration. Can you steal them in the argument for keeping these criminal non-citizens in the country?
So you're claiming that that non-citizens are committing more crimes under the Biden administration?
No, I'm saying there's been more in the Biden administration, so more over the past 4 years than the 4 previous years.
Could I just ask what I want to come back to your question. What follows from this? President-elect Trump is not talking about deporting criminal non-citizens. He's talking about deporting all non-citizens, as I understand it. So however reliable the statistics are, I don't want to quibble about that, but it seems to me that there seems to me to be a gap between the statistics, accepting them at least for the sake of discussion, and the policy that he's advocating.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I'm not familiar with the exact statistic that you're citing too, but if you're just talking about numerically higher, I mean, the border was entirely shut down under the Trump administration for an extensive period of time under Title 42 during the pandemic. So there have just statistically been more admissions under this administration, not because this administration has necessarily been more permissive, but because we weren't dealing with Title 42. So if it's just a numerical citation, I think that would probably account for a lot. But also, I mean, it's like less than 1% of individuals who are undocumented have committed any kind of crime, let alone a serious violent offense.
Sure.
At much lower rates than U.S. citizens, in fact. And so if we're talking about these as criminal aliens, I would also just remind the audience that being in the United States without status is not a criminal violation.
Understood.
And
no priority, having no priority makes everyone a priority, right? And
Right.
so I think I would agree with the professors that I don't think anyone here would support criminals entering the US and not being somehow, regulated or deported. But that's not what Trump is saying. He's saying, let's deport the 13 million undocumented people who are here, whether they have committed a crime or not.
And so what I wanted to say is, I'm calling shenanigans on that question. And no disrespect to you, in part because that is exactly the kind of misinformation that has created an environment in which people can't rationally talk about the actual issues, regardless of what the numbers are. And I'll grant you the numbers. No administration, no elected official has ever claimed that we are going to prioritize or keep criminals in the United States, whether they are accused or especially if they're convicted. And so that becomes a way to distract us from what the others have said on this panel are the fundamental issues, right? It's not the question of criminals, but whether or not we're going to protect people who have not committed crimes or who have not even had any volition in whether they're in this country with proper documentation or not. And that should be, if the concern is how are we going to prioritize that, that has been the position from President Obama and President Biden, that we have limited resources. We are a country that does not have unlimited funds to fund every activity we would want. First thing first, get rid of individuals who are not here with proper documentation and have committed crimes. Right. Wait on the other people. Right. Get that done first.
I feel terrible, but we are at 6 and it really is a hard stop. I want to thank you all for having really wonderful engaged discussions. It will not be our last discussion on these issues. Thank you to our panelists.